host, Sean Temesi, and you're listening to the 6-Year Stint NBA podcast. Today I'm going to highlight some of the controversies that have been surrounding Stanley Johnson and the Detroit Pistons and his recent fall off in the minutes in rotation. And I'm also going to be discussing some other rumors with the Dallas Mavericks. To start off, I would just like to mention that for those who don't know, Stanley Johnson, 2015 number 8 overall draft pick by the Pistons, was taken out of the rotation, given a DNP a few weeks ago by Coach Stan Van Gundy, and eventually he ended up being sent to the Grand Rapids Drive, which is a D-League affiliate of the Pistons, and there he had a very nice 26-point performance. But nevertheless, obviously, this is something that a lot of Pistons fans are concerned with. You know, it's not often that you see someone who's actually had a pretty successful rookie season without being sent to the D-League end up being sent there in their sophomore season. Really not something that we see often, and it's been because his numbers have really fallen off, and he just hasn't really been the player that the Pistons wanted him to be. Coming into the season, I mean, he's averaging 3.5 points per game under 22 games with the Pistons, and he's shooting 30% from the three-point line. Just hasn't really been the factor the X factor really that he was during the 2016 playoffs, and that's where a lot of us got introduced to Stanley Johnson. You know, seeing him guard LeBron James in the first round, and while the Pistons did get swept. And Stanley Johnson wasn't even starting in any of those games. When he did check into the game, you could really feel a presence on the defensive end. And for someone who was 19 years old at the time, that was just insane. And so many people that weren't familiar with Johnson from his college days were really surprised to see, you know, the sort of build that the guy has. And it's really fascinating when you consider that he's 19 years old or 20 years old now, and what he's been able to sort of put together as far as a physique for a guard or forward, whatever you want to call him. He's certainly got a presence on the floor, and I think no one can deny that his body is ready for the NBA. And now some of the problems this season for Stanley Johnson, the first few 20 games in, have been adjusting to the sophomore game, and you could say it's been a sophomore slump. I mean, in 4 games with the Pistons in the playoffs last year, his averages per 36 minutes were 14 points per game, 7 rebounds per game, and just locking down the best player in the NBA, as well as most people could. And he really had a huge contribution, and his usage rate was very high. And we thought that this could be a guy that, at the very least, could be a tremendous sixth man for the Pistons for the time being, whereas they have Marcus Morris and Tobias Harris in that front court kind of wing position, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of room for Johnson. So that's what we kind of assumed, I would say, most Pistons followers, and now it seems like he's getting sent to the D-League. Meanwhile, Reggie Bullock is being given his minutes, which I don't think anybody expected at all. So, Reggie, I mean, it's been a very awkward time because people have high expectations, and a lot of people are saying that now is when the rumors start for Stanley Johnson being eventually traded, and that a lot of people think he's got a very low contract. He's a rookie, but he seems to be a contributor already for playoff teams. So anybody could really be interested in a player like that, especially someone who isn't going to be a liability on the defensive end. I think any team could use better defenders, especially in their bench rotation. So, I mean, apparently, according to reports, the Pistons have been ringing in lots of requests, trade interest from numerous teams, and the Pistons have been shutting all of them down, reportedly, as they're very confident in what they're doing, and apparently are not listening to any trade inquiries, I find this to be really interesting. So I did a little bit of diving in, and I did a little bit of research to find out why exactly the Pistons are doing this to Stanley Johnson, and how they're kind of dealing with this, and why they wouldn't really listen to any offers about trades for a player that they seem to really not value all that much. And what happened is, well, Stan Van Gundy actually said a few weeks ago when he was asked about his decision to not play Stanley, and this was before he was sent to the D-League, and he said that right now we're trying to find out what kind of a player Stanley Johnson can be on the offensive end. He says, we know that he can guard 3 positions on the defensive end. He can actually guard point guards, shooting guards, small forwards, and even the occasional 4. And Stanley Johnson is a proven defender in the eyes of SVG, which is certainly a high praise. But he said that on the offensive end, we need to find his identity. And by that he means that he's so versatile, but he hasn't polished any real aspect, whether that's the three-point range or posting up or coming off of picks or what have you. And he's not really a ball handler either, obviously, for his size and position. But we don't know if he's going to be a 2. This is what SVG was quoted saying. We don't know, is he a tall shooting guard like a Wesley Matthews, who can post up smaller guards but lock down most players on the defensive end. And eventually, maybe a player, if Johnson were to adopt that style, eventually they could work around him becoming an actual three-point threat, someone who can come around screens and eventually, put the ball on the floor or even just get spot-up shots. And he said that's one option we have. The other one is maybe he's a Jay Crowder or possibly a Harrison Barnes type of player. But I like the Jay Crowder comparison actually a lot because of the bulkiness, the defensive prowessness, and I just like that. And I think Jay Crowder is an underrated three-point shooter. And you look at Stanley Johnson, and you really see a solid three-point stroke. Despite shooting 30% this season so far, the mechanics seem to be very nice and very sound for someone his age, and someone who focuses on so many other things. That's a really good habit to have, and it, in some ways, really reminds me of a young Klay Thompson. Just sort of the way he's being used offensively in his first rookie season. That's kind of what he reminded me of. But he seems even further along than Thompson did at the time defensively. So I really don't think there's a limit to what Stanley Johnson can be. And a lot of people are talking about the fact that, rival swingman Justice Winslow was taken, I believe, 10th overall, 2 picks after Stan Johnson. And both were kind of considered the 2 best wings in the draft at the time, I remember. And there's always kind of been that draft rivalry there because, whether they embrace it or not, it's there because they're sort of comparable players in the same draft, right? Obviously, we compare D'Angelo Russell to Emmanuel Mudiay as well from the same draft. So, or Porzingis to Karl Anthony Towns. So there's that there. And a lot of people are saying, well, look at Justice Winslow. He's becoming such a great defender. He's had an increased role under Dwayne Wade, with Dwayne Wade leaving Miami, which, by the way, I think has kind of made Winslow look bad, to be honest, because his numbers have been terrible as well, and he's not getting sent to the D-League. It seems that that organization trusts him a little bit more. Johnson, on the other hand, is kind of fighting for minutes, and it looks like the Pistons are very confident that holding him off for a bit will pay off in the long run. And I think SVG also said from that interview I mentioned before that he said there's a lot of examples of players that, came into their own a little earlier than others, but that doesn't necessarily translate into a more successful career when you look at the whole stretch. And that's a very interesting point, and I actually really respect SVG's commitment to developing players, even ones that seem like they could really make a contribution right away, because usually you don't see coaches doing something like that, because I think we all kind of understand that coaches are more in a win-now mode, and even the nicest coaches like Luke Walton, I mean, they still push these young teams that might not necessarily need to be pushed that much to win playoff games or even get into the playoffs. Even guys like Luke Walton want their players to put up the best numbers and so that they can improve their coaching record. I mean, that's just obviously what coaches are going to do. So for Stan Van Gundy to kind of bench one of his better players to make him better when his team's actually kind of been struggling and not really been having the best of seasons. I mean, they've been a little bit up and down. I think they're still well within the playoff picture, so it's still okay for Detroit. But they want to be a threat in the East, so and they have a lot of players that are ready right now. So for him to stash Johnson like that, I really do respect that a lot. And I've always been a huge fan of SVG from his days in Orlando as well, and I'm really happy to see that, to be honest with you. I just hope that it doesn't ruin the confidence Johnson already, I think, has after, I mean, he did kind of talk some smack to LeBron in the playoffs, as we remember. So, and I took that as a good thing. You know, I took that as the kid had a lot of heart and spirit, and I think losing all those 4 games and getting swept really got to him, and he didn't appreciate that, especially for the effort that he was putting in. And obviously he's got to have to learn to kind of pick his battles, because no one should really be calling out LeBron James. But it was a really good thing to see as a fan. As a spectator, you always want to see guys with that kind of spirit. So I really like this kid, and he seems to be dominant in the D League. He really has no reason to be there other than because his team obviously wants to develop him. And as for what SVG said about, you know, the outcome of him kind of finding his identity, whether that's going to be a Jay Crowder kind of player who can play the 3 or the 4, or if it's more of a Wes Matthews at the 2. I'm excited, and I think both of those things are just as likely to happen. I don't think at this point I could really say which path is a better one for him to follow. It seems that physically he would just be so intimidating for 2 guards. I'm just trying to imagine, like, Avery Bradley, who, for example, who's been having a great season. Imagine him matched up against Stan Johnson. I mean, physically, they just wouldn't. I mean, Avery Bradley's 6'2", and Stanley Johnson's, 6'7", 6'8", maybe. I mean, that'd be some scary stuff. I think that could really work for him. But on the other hand, you know, the way you see someone like a Jay Crowder affecting every single game the Celtics play, he's really become like that second star on that team behind Isaiah Thomas. And I mean, that's no disrespect to Avery Bradley and Al Horford, but it seems like in the clutch situations, a lot of the time they do lean to Crowder. Crowder does often guard the best player on the opposing team, so having a guy like Stan Johnson adopt that kind of role would also be really great, I believe, for the Pistons. But that's obviously something that only time will tell. And clearly this season is not going to be one that we're going to see Stan Johnson on the floor that much for the Pistons in meaningful games. But maybe around playoff time, when they cut that roster down to like 8 or 9 players, I'm as confident as anyone that they'll bring Stan Johnson back. I mean, there's really no reason not to after what he did last year. He was a fantastic player for them. But as far as, you know, trade rumors go or any sort of rumblings about him being treated as more of an asset now and less of a player that's in their core future, I don't buy it. I think people just need to be more patient with him. And when you see the coach / GM that SVG is kind of commenting and saying these kind of kind words about him and really stressing that he's looking to really find an identity for this player, whether it takes a year or maybe 3 years. I'm glad that they're willing to do this, and I think more GMs and more coaches should have this attitude. And I really am on board fully, and yeah, it's just good to see. And I think I'm not sure if having him in the D League is better than having him sit on the bench and sort of watch the Pistons play. Certainly, you would say that maybe as far as trying to find an identity for him, maybe playing a star position in the D League would certainly help that, being the guy. Which actually raises a point I wanted to make. This Grand Rapids Drive team, you talk about the D League expanding. This is really a great example of how much the game has grown and how much I think the D League has grown since its inaugural season in, I think, 2001, I would say. So it's been about 15, 16 years, and it's come a long way. Certainly not at the finish line, but I think what the D League has done is really impressive, and 22 out of 30 teams having their own sort of independent roster to stash in the D League is a really great addition to scouting and sort of player development, especially when kids are coming out of college at 19 years old. We don't really know what to expect. This is a great way to develop players, I believe. And you look at this roster, it's fascinating. Jordan something. What's his name? Not Jordan Clarkson. I'll have to put his name in later, but he's Jordan Crawford. There we go. Jordan Crawford, Stanley Johnson, Ray McCallum, Henry Ellenson. This is a really exciting team. I mean, for a D-League roster, you got a lot of NBA talent there, guys who know how to win, guys who have played meaningful minutes. I remember just not too long ago, Jordan Clarkson, I keep saying Jordan Clarkson. Jordan Crawford was so talented. I mean, we saw that guy really play an effective role in Washington. He kind of bounced around after a few years, but it seemed like he was going to have a career that was going to take off, and it never really happened, unfortunately. But I mean, he's in the D League and he's working his butt off, and it's really fun to watch. I really do recommend tapping into their YouTube highlights. I mean, the D League's really good about releasing their content. A lot of times you can watch games for free live. Certainly not at the caliber of the NBA by any means, but it's certainly something to watch if you really care about young players and following sort of your favorite college players and how they're doing. I mean, you'll find a lot of those guys there kind of trying to prove themselves. And it's an exciting new kind of part of the game where you can sort of root for these underdogs, these younger players to come up, because I'd say 10 years ago or so, it wasn't so likely that these guys would ever really turn into NBA players. And now it feels like they are much more likely to do so. And it's fun to kind of root for these guys. It's fun to see where they're at, see how different situations, letting them play in a star situation is more exciting. And you get to really see who they are. But I think, credit to the Grand Rapids Drive, because they put together a really nice team. So, and also credit to the Detroit Pistons for really utilizing that opportunity. In other news, I just wanted to quickly touch on Andrew Bogut. We ran a poll on our Twitter page, which you should definitely go vote on quick before that runs out of time. Basically, teams like the Portland Trailblazers have been rumored to be seeking, some veteran help after a couple of their free agency signings haven't really paid off at all in Evan Turner and Festus Ezeli so far. So maybe they want to shake things up so that they can get themselves a good playoff seed. They've been rumored to be interested in Andrew Bogut of the Dallas Mavericks, who has been having kind of a down year. I mean, he's on a one-year deal for $11 million, but a lot of people are saying that the Mavericks will still try to trade him at the deadline. A lot of teams could use an expiring contract, and it seems like the Mavericks aren't really going anywhere at this point in the season. And reportedly, they've said that if the playoff hopes seem to be really at a low, where it's just not really plausible thing. 50 or 40 games into the season. I don't know when the trade deadline is exactly, but yeah, at that point, I think it'll be more clear than it already seems to be that the Mavericks are just not going to make the playoffs, and this year's kind of been a waste. So at that point, I mean, you don't need to have like 32, 33-year-old center who really is having a career low in points, career low in minutes played, and I mean, it's just been like really a rough season for Bogut. He's been shooting terribly for a center. I mean, his 2-point percentage is at 48%. He's just been really ineffective, and he's been rebounding a lot, which kind of indicates that he just kind of came in and did exactly what Pachulia was doing last year. But he just doesn't really seem to have the energy or the kick of that guy. So it doesn't really seem to be translating, and that's not even close to why the Mavericks have been as bad as they are. But it's part of the reason. And I just want to point out, Andrew Bogut has shot 27% from the free throw line this season. I mean, that's like Anthony Bennett type numbers right there. I don't know what to say about that, but Bogut clearly doesn't really seem to be a factor. I don't know. I'm not sure Portland really has all that much reason to get him. They already have a lot of centers as well, mobile centers, kind of like Bogut in Marshall or Mason Plumlee and even Festus Ezeli. Just doesn't really make a lot of sense. But the Mavericks are probably going to take whatever they can get, whether that's a dump of a salary, or maybe sources are saying that they're looking at trying to get a first-round pick from a contender, which would probably be a top 30 to top 20 pick, something like that. I don't think a lot of teams are going to be looking to give up a draft pick like that for someone like Bogut, especially in a very good draft like the one that we're looking at this season. I'm not really sure that's about to happen, but I could see him being traded for someone who's just trying to get off a team. It'll probably be one of those deadline deals that we really don't care about, doesn't really affect anybody, and and I don't think it's going to be a permanent location for Bogut, who I think probably is either going to spend the next 2 or 3 years spinning out of the league by playing on like 4 or 5 different teams, or he's just going to flat out retire. Or maybe he'll go back to Australia, play for the Sydney Kings or something like that. I don't know. I just don't think that he's got a place in the NBA anymore, to be honest with you. And it's sad because, I mean, he was a big part of a championship a few years ago, but the age is just kind of caught up to him, and he's never really been a healthy center. So I'm not sure that there's really all that much to be excited about with Bogut trades. But yeah, definitely check out our poll on Twitter and give that a vote. See if you're with the majority or not. See how that is, and make sure you retweet that to your friends. But yeah, thanks for listening, guys. Just a quick little episode with me. Hope you guys enjoyed, and make sure that you tweet at us if you have any comments, any kind of discussions you want to have, and make sure that you email us 6yearstint@gmail.com. You can tweet at us at 6yearstint. Make sure you subscribe to our iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube account, all under 6 Year Stint NBA podcast, wherever you want to look that up. And thanks for listening, guys. My name's John Tomesi, and you're listening to the 6 Year Stint NBA podcast.